Good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatsoever. Hello from cold Germany these days. My name is Frederick, and I'm currently the focal point for the Major Group Children and Youth to the UNFF, and also one of two focal points for the UNFF subcommission within IFSA. And together with my colleagues, we established this webinar. And two of my colleagues, Alina Laikonen from Finland, she's currently the head of the UNFCCC subcommission, and Barbara Oellerer, she is from Austria and the head of the Forest Europe subcommission, will join me today to facilitate the webinar. Yeah, in these very turbulent times, I wish everyone more or less a happy International Day of Forest 2020 on the topic of forest and biodiversity. And I think I want to share with you also a personal note here. What we face right now globally is that we realize we live in a globalized world and we share all this problem of Corona, but we also share positive things. And I think all of us work in the forestry sector, in forest management, forest conservation, and in the sector of forest biodiversity. And we should remind us that there are other things in life that connect us and give us meaning and are important even in difficult times. So IFSA and UNFF MGCY decided to have this webinar today with you, and we invited great speakers whom we are extremely grateful that they can join on a Saturday at lunchtime, at least in Central Europe. And I want to warmly welcome Christian Schwarze. He is one of the founders of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network and the current focal point. And Yara Achaf, she is one of the coordinators of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network in Lebanon, and she has a forestry background. In addition to that, we have Karl von Amegulashvili. He is currently the head of the Biodiversity and Forestry Department of the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Agriculture in Georgia. And finally, we are very grateful to have with us Mr. Ben Gunneberg. He's the CEO and Secretary General of PEFC International. We will have now around 60 minutes of presentations. Each group, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, has 20 minutes. Karl has 20 minutes, and also Mr. Van Gunneberg has 20 minutes. We will begin with a brief overview on the current discussions of the zero draft for the post-Aichi CBD targets. And we will get an input on why forest and biodiversity is especially important to youth constituency. Following on that, we will get an input from Karl von Amegulashvili on the importance of forest protection and forest restoration in order to protect and enhance biodiversity. And then to a certain extent, maybe contrasting that position, there will be an input from Mr. Van Gunneberg on the role of forest certification and the structure and the work of PEFC, with a special focus on how can forest certification tackle biodiversity loss, how can they protect biodiversity, and where are challenges to really get hard numbers, how forest certification can enhance biodiversity. Before kicking off, I would kindly ask everyone again who joined later now to switch off the videos and also to mute the speakers if not already done so. And you have the possibility throughout the whole webinar to post questions in the group chat. Please direct the questions as specific as possible to the speakers, and Alina and Barbara will facilitate after the input presentations the question and answer session. And we have a limited time, but we try to answer as many questions as possible. So feel free to make it an interactive session. And with that, I would open the floor for the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. And thank you again for joining.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Max, for Frederick, for the very kind invitation to join you today. We're really grateful for this fantastic opportunity. Ladies first, Jara, would you like to start with a little input, and then I'm going to talk more about post 2020?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, this is Ziara from Lebanon. I've recently started the Global Youth Biodiversity Network Lebanese chapter, and I'll be giving just a brief overview about my country and biodiversity, forests in Lebanon, and I will just end it with a very short message. So to start with, I'd like to talk a little bit about Lebanon because I don't know if many of you know, but the Lebanese flag is centered by the cedar tree. Lebanon has always had this pride of biodiversity, richness, and of being a country, a green country. This has recently changed in the last few decades, and biodiversity loss is happening at an alarming rate, as expected. It's similar in many other countries. The latest national report that Lebanon sent to the Convention on Biological Diversity was in January 2019. In the report, we mentioned that species richness in Lebanon is between low and medium. However, threatened species richness is very close to
Yara, can you still hear us? Because your connection was not
high.
good.
And the report also mentions that policies in Lebanon have not changed, and nothing has given the priority to biodiversity. Government policies haven't changed. The behavior of major sectors in the country have also been the same. So basically, the national report that we send to the CBD is just an update.
Yara, can you still hear us?
I'm sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry, what was the last thing you heard so I can continue?
The biodiversity policies in Lebanon.
Okay. Yeah, I'm so sorry about the connection. Okay, so yeah, I was just mentioning that policies in Lebanon haven't changed. The government haven't taken any serious action regarding major sectors haven't changed their behaviors either. So the national report that we send to the CBD is basically just an update about species numbers, threats to biodiversity in the country, etc. So it's not about telling updates on what we have done, because very little action has been done over the years. What we update the CBD once in a while through the national reports. So concerning the threats, I think these specific ones in Lebanon include habitat loss, degradation, fragmentation. Most of these are coming from anthropogenic activities, human activities, including quarries. Most of them are illegal in Lebanon. Illegal clearing of vegetative cover, forest fires, which we have been struggling with for several years. Our forest fire season has been increasing the number of months for the last several years, and every year there's in the same day erupting across all Lebanese forests. This past year, on October 17th, it was a devastating day where more than 200 fires also destroyed forests across Lebanon. So I think we share many of these threats with other countries and other forests. I'd like to point out here that, as I mentioned, most of the causes are caused by us, by humans, by corporations, even individuals, even indirect causes to this biodiversity degradation, like climate change, unplanned urbanization. So in our case, is not doing much to change the status quo. I'd like to point out once again to the importance of biodiversity and how people are disconnected, even rural people in Lebanon, and I think it's mostly similar in other places. People do not feel this connection to nature, even if they live very close to it. You know, we need to remind ourselves that forests are not only the suppliers of goods that we use. We depend on them. They are the providers of services that are essential for our well-being. So my message today is that we should give forests and their biodiversity the importance, agreements, etc. We should be more strict. I know from our case in Lebanon, we're not very serious about including because there's no, you know, putting accountability. Also like to add that biodiversity conservation should be a priority. There's no argument that biodiversity should not be one of the most important topics discussed. We depend on it to survive, as I mentioned, and the attention that has been given to biodiversity because its services are indirectly benefiting people, or mostly people living in cities do not know the benefits that they're getting from forests, etc. So this disconnection that we have is leading to biodiversity not being seriously discussed on a higher level. And one thing that I always go back to in my research is that approaches should always focus on community engagement. We should listen to the people living in forests next to them, rural people who know forests and understand them. Scientists have studied these threats and the importance of biodiversity for years, but local people also have their experience which could help. So yeah, my final message is that it's all based on individual actions. Okay, I think you can still hear me, sorry. So, you know, policies are shaped by individuals, organizations are managed by individuals. Each person can make a difference, and years will be able to have more impact in policy shaping, or if you're already at some at positions where we can get other people's.
Yara, I think we lost you again. Yara, can you still hear us?
Voices heard, rural people.
Okay, I'm very sorry. I think Jara's internet connection is a bit shaky.
Yeah.
Yara, unless you still have something, then I would continue. Is that okay, or? Right, okay. It seems like we lost Jara. I'm very sorry, but maybe this also tells a little bit of a lesson that there's still a lot that needs to be done in the world, especially when it comes to internet speeds. unfortunately, this is also the reality for many people that we try to work online, but there are some limitations. Yara, thank you so much for your inputs and also for reminding us about what forests and biodiversity are really about, and that we as individuals, in organizations, in our different capabilities can do something. I will now continue talking a little bit about the CBD process, the post-2020 process, and what this is all about. And it's usually a very dry topic. It's about laws, it's about international agreements. So I was thinking maybe I can shake it up a little bit. So we will also talk about carousels today. And yeah, this is the CBD carousel that you can see over here. It's in operation since 1992. It has 196 parties, so almost all parties, all countries in the world are part of the CBD, except the one, and that is the US, and that is extremely helpful because other than in other processes like the UNFCCC, they have less possibilities to complicate things in the CBD, so that helps us to get a couple of things done. In reality, it's a bit more complicated, but we can talk about this another time. The CBD is a multilateral environmental agreement, and it is a framework convention. And I just mentioned this in order to bring us all to the same page. A framework convention means that the CBD is not a convention that provides detailed guidance on how we're going to protect biodiversity. It articulates rather a consensus among all countries that we're going to do something, that we're going to hold biodiversity laws together, but it doesn't go into the concrete actions on how this goal is going to be achieved. The CBD consists of three main objectives that are guiding all these activities, and that's the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use, and then the third one is to ensure the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. So this is like just a little bit of an overview, and now we're going to continue a little bit and start to enter into the post-2020 process. And I have divided this into different parts of this carousel ride, and part one starts a little bit earlier. It starts in 2002, because what happened in 2002 is that countries came together and they formulated one of these concrete actions that I just talked about, and that was the 2010 biodiversity target. Like what you can remember about this 2010 biodiversity target is that all governments committed back then, almost 20 years ago, that they're going to work together to significantly reduce the current rate of biodiversity loss on all levels. Unfortunately, that didn't go so well. There were a couple of problems. When they did this in 2002, there were no indicators, there was no baseline, so it was really hard to like track how far we're getting with this. Another problem was that there was not enough coordination of different policies. There was no integration of biodiversity policies into agriculture or into forestry policy, for instance. Biodiversity at that point was pretty much looked at as a standalone policy, and that's just not how it works. Then, if you want to implement actions, you need resources. It's not just about financial resources, but it's also about human resources, training. You need the expertise to like implement all these activities, and that was lacking. Another problem was low political priority. There were simply not enough political leaders giving priority to conserving biodiversity. And then another very important point was not addressing underlying drivers like production, consumption patterns, subsidies, all these kind of things that are driving biodiversity loss and that are not like focused on as a primarily root cause. And this is the result of this. So the 2010 biodiversity target failed miserably. You can see this here on this overview. Almost none of the targets could be received. The only target that was received, that was accomplished, was protected areas, because in this regard, they were able to increase the number of protected areas globally. And I'm showing you all of this because it's quite interesting, because not so much has changed afterwards. What I want to note before I go to the strategic plan from 2010 to 2020 is that the implementation period of this target was rather short. It was only 8 years. And you can see here on this graphic that only very few countries, 35 out of 193, suggested what we call national biodiversity strategies and action plans. These are like national action plans that every country has to create in order to comply with the CBD. And once such a target is adopted, they are responsible to revise and update those plans. And as you can see here, very few countries did it. And that also has to do that 8 years is simply not enough to like revise MB subs and also see an impact on the ground. And this is one of the nice statements that the CBD executive secretary back then gave. He said that basically the 2010 biodiversity target was poorly implemented, there were not enough resources available, and he promised that the same mistake is not going to be made again. So let's see what really happens. Let's look to the next decade, to 2010 to, oh, this is wrong, to 2010 to 2020. This decade, as you know, started quite interesting. There was a huge pressure on the CBD. Just the year before, the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit took place, and it was a complete disaster. And basically, since then, a lot of environmental conferences are measured against Copenhagen. And there was tremendous pressure on the CBD to show that international environmental governance can still deliver. So it delivered. It was almost a miracle. It was 2 weeks of marathon negotiations. And at that point, everybody celebrated. The CBD gave a press statement in which they said, we're now entering into a new era of harmony with nature. So let's look what really happened. So these are the Aichi biodiversity targets. If you look at the individual targets, there are 20 out of them, organized in 5 strategic goals that you can see here on the left side. And these targets for themselves are fantastic. Like, they have really strong language, they're really ambitious, so ambitious that part of them are quite unrealistic. And now let's look at this. Starts to look similar, right? So there are only 4 targets out of the 20 where we're on track to achieve them. And one of them is, again, the target on protected areas, because it's quite easy to increase the coverage of protected areas, at least on the paper. If in reality you really change something in terms of the management of protected areas, is a completely different question. Whether these protected areas also exist in reality is also not a question. And then the other targets where we're making progress is that we put the Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing into force. And yes, we had more success this time with the updating and development of national biodiversity strategies. But the other targets, the targets where you really have to do something, like on eradicating harmful subsidies, where you need political will, resources, and really strong support, not just in the environmental ministry, but beyond, we're making no or even negative progress. So this is the sad status of the Aichi biodiversity targets. Another problem lies with the targets themselves. They were not quantifiable. They had like a very nice, very good sounding message, but they were difficult to measure in terms of progress. Then the reporting was difficult. It was not really clear how parties gonna report on the actions that they have taken. Not enough progress in underlying drivers. Again, very similar to what happened with the 2010 target. Then a number of implementation challenges. When we adopted the Aichi biodiversity targets in 2010, we didn't adopt a resource mobilization strategy at the same time. So what happens is that in order to update national biodiversity strategies, you need resources, you need human resources, you need all kind of support in order to really make sure that the situation on the ground changes. But those resources only came available from the end of 2012, and even then it took up to 2-3 years before countries could actually receive these resources. And then you can see it took like until 2014 for them to get the resources, then another 2 years to like update their national biodiversity strategies. Then it was already 2016, and then how much time is actually left to like really do something on the ground? Then some usual problems that I just mentioned to you before. Political priority was very high in 2010, And then over the decade, over the course, other political priorities came into the field, and biodiversity simply became out of the focus. Policy coherence is another issue. We talked about this before. And then a very key problem of all these international processes, they're designed in a top-down approach, and there is very little bottom-up. But we need people like you. We need people like foresters, indigenous people. We need people that work in local communities, that are active on the ground to come to those meetings and really remind us, is what we are discussing really changing the situation on the ground? So bottom-up processes is something that is really important. And obviously the same problems, no change in consumption and production patterns, because that requires other sectors to take action too. So let's go to part 3. Are we going to do it better in part 3 of the carousel ride? And that's the post-2020 process. Simply speaking, post-2020 is a process to come up with a follow-up to the strategic plan that is going to expire at the end of this year. And it is about defining global action to address biodiversity loss, this time not just for the CBD, but as a framework for all, a framework for the entire UN system. Unfortunately, we're facing some difficulties at the moment. You can see this is how the preparatory process was supposed to look like, and everything after March is postponed at the moment due to the virus. Like all these meetings here that you can see are currently postponed. We don't really know how this process is going to continue. It is possible that we're not going to have our COP in 2020, or that we will have our COP, that we are not going to adopt the post-2020 agreement at this COP meeting, that it will happen sometime later. We really don't know. What I'm going to tell you now is where we're standing in terms of the negotiations, but what is going to happen in the next months, we are yet to find out. So there is what we call a zero draft, which is like a first draft and the basis of a document to guide the negotiations for this post-2020 agreement. It was created by 2 chairs of the so-called open-ended working group on post-2020. The chairs are Francis from Uganda and Basil from Canada. And they came up with a draft that was ordered by all parties to the CBD in August 2019. It's a rather long document. I posted the link below, so you can just go to the CBD website and take a look if you want. To quickly guide you through it, the zero draft is structured in the way you can see here. We have a vision for the year 2050. It is the same that we had adopted in 2010, living in harmony with nature. Then we have different proposed goals for 2030, and then we have targets that are supposed to be achieved by 2030 or 2050. And these targets are then being supported with enabling conditions, implementation support mechanisms, and responsibility and transparency mechanisms. This is how it's supposed to work, but I understand it's still quite abstract. So let's look at the concrete elements of this zero draft. So we have the 2050 vision. I already talked about it, basically living in harmony with nature. And then we have the goals that I mentioned. You can see them here. I marked in red the goals that are especially important for you guys working on forests. This is specifically goal A, which is focusing on no net loss of biodiversity by 2030. Then we have a mission for 2030. These are all proposals at the moment. So throughout the negotiating process, this will all change. And we will probably going to see that it's definitely not going to stay the way it is. But the 2030 mission currently reads to take urgent action across society to put biodiversity on a path to recovery for the benefit of planet and people. Now, let's take a quick look at the action targets, and then I'm also done. What is most important for you working in forestry are the proposed targets A1 and A2. A1 is on retaining and restoring ecosystems, increasing the area of conservation, increasing connectivity, and integrating intact areas. And it also has a sub-target on wilderness areas. Target A2 is on protecting sites of particular importance for biodiversity through protected areas, and a new category of conservation measures, which we refer to as other effective area-based conservation measures. The other targets you can see here for illustration, but I think they're less relevant for the work that you're currently doing. Then under goal B, we have another proposed target on conserving and enhancing the sustainable use of biodiversity in agriculture and other managed ecosystems. So that's also relevant for forestry. The other targets here are on other issues. Then we have targets under D, which is more focusing on tools and solutions. So you can see here C12 is on reforms and on the elimination of harmful subsidies. Then we have a target on capacity building. We have a target on awareness, target 17. People everywhere take measurable steps towards sustainable consumption lifestyles. So there are a number of targets that are very relevant. For us as young people, target C19 is very important because for the first time it recognizes the importance of intergenerational equity and the involvement of indigenous people, local communities, women and girls, and it also specifically mentions youth here. So that's quite good. This is something that we have been lobbying for as Gibbon, and we're happy that it's in. And you can also see in the enabling conditions use are mentioned as well. These are some updates from the last meeting of negotiations that took place in Rome. This is the team that we had at the negotiations. We did a number of activities. We had an advocacy training with all youth delegates that participated. These are some impressions from the interventions we delivered. And these are the outcomes of the meeting. There are 3 documents. You can download them all on the CBD website. There is document L1, which is a summary of the meetings that have been organized before in order to provide input for the negotiations. And we have document L2, which summarizes the discussion on targets 1 to 11. And finally, document L3, which focuses on the discussion for targets 12 and 20. What is important to understand is that even though this was designed as a negotiating session, it was much more a discussion meeting. So parties collectively reviewed the 0 draft that I walked you through and provided comments, suggestions for alternative text. Observers like the Global Youth Biodiversity Network could also propose text. And then the chairs went on to summarize all of that. So we're not really in a stage of this process where we're like going deep into the negotiations. We're currently like collecting different kinds of input, collecting different kinds of feedback. Then probably in the next meeting, whenever it's going to happen, we will have more in-depth discussions on the technical aspects of this framework. Yeah, there's like still a lot of unclarity among parties when it comes like on how we're going to design this process, how we're going to discuss targets. There's also a lot of questions on how all these previous meetings kind of feature in. What is also important to mention, we have some parties who are blocking progress. The party that is blocking the most at the moment is Brazil. They have a very strong mandate from their government to make sure that they get as much financial resources as possible and have to commit to as little environmental goals as possible. So that's really problematic for the negotiations at the moment. Obviously, the background, the political background is more complicated than this. You are probably aware of the situation with the Amazon fires last year and how the Brazilian president has responded to that by basically spreading fake news like that these fires were started by environmentalists. So the situation in Brazil is very complicated, and unfortunately this is also spilling over into the CBD. Other than this, for us as youth, the negotiations were very successful. These are some examples of all the texts where we were able to not just integrate the reference to use, but we were also able to propose targets that are focusing on issues like transformative education. We have intergenerational equity for the first time in the CBD officially reflected in those targets. So that's pretty good, and we're quite happy with those successes that we had in terms of advocacy work. and we just hope that the text will mostly stay the way it is, but it will be a huge fight to defend it. We also have a target on intergenerational knowledge transmission. There are other targets on human rights, for instance, and keeping all the substance in the text is going to be a challenge for the months to come, depending on how things going to fold out. For you, with regards to forests, there was also quite a bit of discussion on forests. What was recognized by parties is that forests are currently not being strongly mentioned in the text in the zero draft as it is. So there were proposals for new targets that I just wanted to show you here. There is a target that could focus on enhancing contributions of all types of forests to biodiversity conservation. There was another proposal to ensure that 100% of areas under agriculture and aquaculture are sustainably managed with zero new habitat conversion or deforestation. So there is an increasing awareness about the importance of including forests in a more prominent way. And we also have to see how it will be supported. Interesting is also proposals under Target 6, which is focusing on nature-based solutions. And there were also several parties that mentioned that sustainable forest management needs to be included here. Yeah, basically that's it. I see there were a couple of points in the chat. I don't know if there were questions. I was not able to read them simultaneously, but I can go through them now.
Thank you so much, Christian, for this very holistic, historical, and also present perspective on the developments. Our team of Barbara and Alina, they will collect the questions now. You can also have a look at the questions, and we will come back to a question answer session in the end. For now, thank you again for that input. And now I would open the floor for Karl Amegulashvili. For those who just joined recently, he is the head of the Biodiversity and Forestry Department at the Ministry for Environmental Protection and Agriculture in Georgia. And he will give us an input on current and past developments with respect to forest restoration, forest protection for biodiversity protection. Hello, Karl.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. First time, but the situation today in the world is complicated. So this is, I think, very nice opportunity to celebrate this day, Forestry Day and Forest. Speaking now from Georgia, which is one of the Earth's biologically richest regions, as you know, and a region between two very, very interesting parts of the world. So from the WWF identified priority places because of their very rich biodiversity, which is at the same time a very threat because of human activities and the infrastructure and economic development. And I like to start, before I share the experiences from Georgia and from the Caucasus region. Here was mentioned a presentation given by previous speaker about CBD and the important steps which was planned for post-2020. But I think for the forestry, as well as for the biodiversity generally in the world, will be a new challenge now, because after the coronavirus and the epidemic situation, will be lots of resources needed for the infrastructure, for further development of the countries. And the topic of the biodiversity and the forestry will be more and more important. So I think the international institutions and the national authorities will re-update their strategies and actions regarding forestry, forest management, and the biodiversity in future. So this will be, from my point of view, a new reality. So now I like to talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah, clearly.
Thank you. I like to start with the actions and share with you about the reform process in Georgia. More or less, this kind of reform process is for the Caucasus countries the same. So 2013, because of lots of problems in the forestry and biodiversity, we started a newly reform process. And interesting was that the first time of the country's history was by the parliament of country adopted a national forest concept. So the national, so-called national forestry policy. And since this time, we are step by step developing the processes based on the actions and already identified priorities in the forestry policy. So identified was the imperfect legislation, weak forest management institutions, and very, very poor enforcement of law. Also the insufficient consideration given to forest values in planning and decision-making process, poverty level, and the green jobs, also lack of awareness, especially, and the lack of awareness not only was identified as a problem, not only by the local population, indigenous people, and so on, but also by the governmental institutions. As I represent the government, I also can say, and I'm often has discussions with my colleagues in different ministries, that their awareness and the knowledge and the general education in field of biodiversity and forestry is very bad. And if we are talking about the country's development, especially, which is very important in developing countries or countries in transition, it is very important to understand and recognize that the forests and the biodiversity is playing a really big role in our life. Of course, there was identified a problem of financing, forest fires, burning of agricultural lands, the problem in the last year of diseases, forest diseases, and the very rush process in the south part of country of desertification. So the part of country which is on the boundary of Azerbaijan and Armenia, in these regions in Georgia, we already have such a problems. And this will be also a new challenge, not only for Georgia or Caucasus countries, for many other countries, speaking about the desertification, if we don't move completely to the sustainable forest management and proper protection of biodiversity. And the last point, which I like now to underline, which is very specific for Georgia, but for the Eastern Partnership countries, also countries in Africa and other continents and countries, this is the social, so-called social cutting. By the way, this is also was identified and recognized in the forestry and biodiversity legislation, also in the National Action Plan and Strategy of Biodiversity, so-called NBSAP. This is the social cutting. This means that the country is cutting lots of thousands of wood only for the fuel use as a firewood. And this is a very unsustainable practice, but it is linked with the social problems and not good regulated infrastructure in the forestry. Now I like to go forward with the main findings and of the policy of Georgia in the forestry and biodiversity. The first important step which was identified is the principle of the sustainable management of the forest. 2015, we created a special working group with all the stakeholders, and according to the definition which is adopted by the Ministerial Conference of the Protection of Forests in Europe, so everybody knows the Forest Europe process, we developed our own, based on these international principles, own criteria for sustainable forest management and the indicators for the management bodies like forestry enterprises. The second one is the precautionary principle to maintain the protective function of the forest and of course their ecological balance. And identified was that management of the forest has to consider the role of the forest and associated ecosystems in the local, at the local, regional, national, and global level. We are doing now lots of steps to more and more include in the forestry activities this precautionary principle, not only on the legislative and the policy level, but also to move to the real management in the forest. Very interesting is that our forestry policy identifies a special principle and direction of all forests, which means that all forests are local. So why, and here we see very big importance in the everyday life of our local rural population, speaking about the collection of the non-timber forest products. We identified in Georgia that more than 135 types of products are collecting in the forest from from the use of for each family, for the households, but also for the export purposes. This means that the unsustainable use of the forest will very much very negatively impact on the non-timber forest products, and of course the whole process on the livelihood of the people. So all forests are local. This principle is now under the development, what we exactly mean and how we can include the people and how we can work hand in hand for the proper protection of forests and biodiversity, but at the same time, how we can use under the sustainability these more than 100 different types of non-timber forest products. A very important issue was the separation of the policy, management, and the supervision functions. So maybe not for all European countries, but outside of the European countries, it's a big problem identified as illegal cutting, illegal use of the resources, but also illegal export. So it is very important to separate the policy function. And in 2013 was created a forest policy service under the Ministry of Environment. We separated completely the functions of policy, strategical planning, and the management. And for the management, we are creating special enterprises in the whole country. And we strongly separated the functions of the controlling, so the supervision. This, we see that we have some numbers, and we see that every year it is going in the better way and helps the ministry and the people also and the regions to protect the nature, to protect the forests, and to exclude the illegal activities from the everyday forestry management. And the very big part of the forestry, and the last, is the forestry as an integral part of the general sustainable development of country, speaking about tourism, ecotourism, different services, of course, energy, and very special part is the agriculture. I mentioned that the agricultural burning of the fields is a big, really huge problem. On one hand, this is a problematic for the general biodiversity, soil diversity, but also for the forest, because often we see that the forest fire is coming from the agricultural burning. I like now to continue with 2 or 3 very important, underline very important issues. Since this development 2013, so the creation of the forest policy, the separation of the functions, and the creation of the criteria for the sustainable forest management and their indicator, Georgia launched the process in 2015 to draft the new forest code, but also to draft the new biodiversity law. And this is for all of us a new trend, that how to include the processes of the biodiversity more and more in the forestry activities, as we all know that the forestry is a very conservative direction, and back the forestry in the biodiversity. I think the experience of Georgia is interesting because the forest policy and biodiversity is now under one umbrella in a Department of Biodiversity and Forestry, together with hunting, fishery issues, international commitments and conventions, processes in the biodiversity and forestry. And it helps really to create new trends now for post-2020 biodiversity on the national level, but also to support these nicely written and recognized policy directions. So the new forest code is a revolutionary for our country. And beside of this corona crisis, 2 days ago, the Georgian parliament adopted the forest code. From many international institutions, including the FAO forestry section, was a very huge attention. When will be this code adopted? Because we are working more than 6 years on this code. And this code reflects and is based on all the directions and principles of the already mentioned national policy of forestry. So how to create the sustainable forest management, how to involve the people, the locals in the decision making. But 2 steps I like to now share with you. This is the forestry inventory process. So we split it, the inventory process, in 2 directions. First, the management level inventory, and it is recognized and it is obligation for all management bodies that the management plans of the forestry is now obligatory for all enterprises to fulfill. And we started the National Forest Inventory as a political process. The education, we identified that maximum 3,000 hectares of area of the forest. We need minimum 1 foresters and 3 forest workers. Maybe for European understanding, this is too big number, but from the 19th till today, this was open, and in some cases we had problems that only 1 forester had to protect and to manage more than 7,000 hectare forest. So this is, I think, a progressive step now. And the last is the landscape approaches and the biodiversity issues. Concretely, to concrete this, 3 different type of approaches we are now doing in the country. We are creating and working on the biosphere reserves, to create the biosphere reserves in country with more than 60% of the forestry coverage to, on one hand, support the sustainable forest management, but also the biodiversity protection to support. We are creating the strong network of Natura 2000 in the non-EU countries. So in Georgia's case will be the Emerald Network, so-called. And now we have 1.3 million hectare of country territory more than 700,000 hectares of forest inside of the Natura 2000 network. This means that for example, unique beech forests, untouched forests, we should protect and manage based on the requirements of the Bern Convention and the general rules of procedures of the management of the emerald sites. And the newly approaches is the co-management of the forest and biodiversity protection under the IUCN category 5, the protected landscape. And we are creating now the new areas, how to manage forest and the biodiversity protection, how to merge these two issues and combine management under the protected landscape. And the last points, I know that I have 3 more minutes. Like to talk about reforestation and afforestation activities, and give a message that we see in Georgia's case, where we have 98% of country territories natural forests and the mountain forests, and very good conditions of the self-regeneration, natural regeneration, that the plantation, fast-growing plantation is for the economic direction very good and interesting, but we should be careful, especially in countries where we have a potential to support the ecological processes in the forest and to support the natural regeneration. And the country has, under the NBSAP, under the CBD, under different other international obligations, and especially under the Paris Agreement, the national determined contribution for country, and we included in this NDC a special chapter of forestry and biodiversity. And the obligation is that that the country should manage the forests under the sustainable forest management principles and protect the biodiversity in different numbers, in percentages. So also as an obligatory and not obligatory directions we have in this NDC, this means that we have a special plan for the reforestation, afforestation measures, and special task in this NDC. Why I am talking about this NDC is the supporting of the natural forest regeneration, and also to create a temporary, close to nature based temporary forest nurseries in the forestry. So this is for all the Caucasian countries very important after such a degradation after the 19th, especially after the independence of the countries in our region, to now to more and more strengthen our effort, our financial also effort for the sustainable forest management. And if we are talking about the biodiversity, more and more support the natural processes in the forest, as the forests, especially in countries in Caucasus, are the migration routes to many animal species, and especially bird species, and it is the region, a corridor, a natural corridor between European and Asia. So we should be more careful by the management of and by the rural development also, and by the management of forests, because we have a special obligations of the protection of forests. And to compare, more than 400 tree species we have naturally in Georgia. This is speaking about the high diversity, and the coverage is 40%. So this automatically means that it is a huge obligation, huge responsibility, and not only for the proper management of forests, but also for the population, which is who are very much demanding on the forest resources. So here I will finish my presentation, Thank you again for inviting me in this webinar, and if there will be questions, I'm ready to answer. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlo, for your input, to also give us the chance to have a very specific understanding of the current situation in Georgia. I will summarize a few points later. Now I would switch to our last speaker, Mr. Ben Gunneberg. He is the CEO and Secretary General of PEFC International. For those who are not so familiar with PEFC, it is considered the certification system for small forest owners. And currently there are around, if I'm not mistaken, 300 million hectares under PEFC certification. To also give you a feeling how much that is, we have in Germany right now 11 million hectares of forest. So it's a huge amount. I'm very happy that he's joining us, that he's with us. So yeah, hello, Ben.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me, Frederick?
Yes, I can.
Good. Okay, then I'll start. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. I would maybe like to start, first of all, to say that one of the things that resonated with me very, very strongly is the need to listen to local communities, as was pointed out by Yara. And Christian talked about the problems of top-down approaches. And one of the things about PFC is its unique bottom-up approach, which I will talk about a little bit further. And then, of course, always the question of resources. That's a key challenge for us. I also think that we need to think much more of forests as local forests, as Carlo pointed out, in order to make sure that we can contribute as much as possible to the biodiversity targets, and that sustainable forest management can be promoted further than it is currently being promoted. So if I come to the first slide, here we go. You know, we're already aware of the fact that the role of the forest is very important in supporting the sustainable development goals. You know, 80% of the Earth's land, animals and plants live in and around forests, biodiversity. That's why it's so important. Yet we're still losing quite a lot to deforestation for other agricultural products, and that is why the reputation overall of forestry in the mindset is still of society is still very bad. As we know, for example, over 40% of all people still think that cutting down trees is a bad thing, and under millennials in particular, that number is actually much higher. So as the future foresters of tomorrow, you actually have a very huge communication role in communicating with people to start being proud about the good work we're doing in forests, to understand the good work that we're doing in forests, and to realize that forests are vitally important for helping in climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. Carbon storage, of course, is important in forests, and as we know, 75% of the fresh water that we are all drinking come through forest catchment areas, and of course, 1 in 6 persons in the world is in some way impacted living in and around forests and living from forests. So it is very, very huge area as far as the sustainable development goal is concerned, and as an energy source, it is still the single most important source for renewable energy. So let's have a quick look then at how do we protect this fantastic biodiversity and this fantastic type of forests that we have. The challenges that we have, of course. Yes.
Ben? All right, great. Just briefly, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you need to still share your screen.
Oh, have I not shared my screen yet? I'm terribly sorry. Let me just do that.
Right, you're right.
All right,
sorry.
I'm sorry. What have I done here? Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, sorry. Is that now? Is it with you now?
Currently, we see your desktop.
That's not the right thing. Let me just give you the right one. I'm so sorry. Let me just get this correct. There we go. How's that?
Awesome.
Can you see it without the Zoom chat and everything else? Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
You just see the screen. Good. Fantastic. This was the nice photograph I was showing you of the of the biodiversity of the Sustainable Development Goals and some of the key criteria, or some of the key Sustainable Development Goals which are being met by forests. I mean, the whole forest value chain in itself addresses all of the Sustainable Development Goals in different ways, and we have quite a lot of information available for that on our website. But we're focusing here on biodiversity, and then also, can we actually achieve that well through multi-functionally managed forests, yes or no? So let's come then to some of the current macro problems that we have. Increasingly, people are moving away from looking for alternatives for fossil fuel. We've got an increasing population. We've got an increasing demand, therefore, for timber. It's been estimated that basically we're going to see 3 times the demand for world's forests, for wood from the world's forests alone by 2050. And of course, the question is, how do we manage that at a time when we're actually losing forest areas? And how do we actually manage the major commitments, political commitments to reforestation in a way that they will result in biodiversity and increasing biodiversity at the same time, whilst providing the wood that we need for packaging and everything else in the future. So we also know that why sustainable forest management. We know that we need to provide local communities with long-term livelihoods. Sustainable livelihoods is vital, is one of the key fundamental cornerstones of sustainable forest management. At a time when 50% of the world's population lives in cities, and that's going to go up to 75%, we need to create a kind of environment for people within the countryside to continue working there, not just looking at forestry, but looking at it from a landscape point of view. So we need to get out of our silos, stop thinking in silo mentality, and start getting to a holistic approach towards how we do sustainable forest management within the landscape, trying to create a sustainable development for rural communities in a way that is meaningful, and where we don't have perverse incentives pushing people to do things which then impact negatively on biodiversity and aspects such as that. So then let's go on to where we are with forest certification. You'll be very surprised to hear from me as the CEO of PFC International to say I don't think that certification is a panacea for the world's problems or the world's forest problems. I know that in the 20 to 25 years that the forest certification movement has been working, our colleagues in FSC and ourselves, we've only got 13% of the world's forest area certified. That's actually quite slow progress. It was quite fast at the beginning, but we see that in voluntary initiatives that happens quite a lot, whether it's coffee or soy or even palm oil. You see rapid growth at the start, and then you see plateauing. And that is one of the reasons why we need to make sure that we have the cooperation and collaboration of governments as well. We need to do this as civil society and as governments in order to achieve those kind of targets that we need to do, and of course those who are actually doing the work on the ground and are impacted by it. So only 28% of the world's industrial roundwood production is certified. And you know that's actually even a worse figure when you consider that half of the world's usage of timber is from for fuel wood, and it doesn't count as part of the industrial roundwood production figures. So there are a lot of challenges ahead of us on how we deal with these things. Yes, we are still growing. Last year, PFC, we grew 17 million hectares. You know, it was a nice feeling to be growing on an average of at least 1.3 million hectares per year. But a lot of that per month. But a lot of that was actually also the fact that there are a lot of people are dual certifying, and that's one of those issues that we need to resolve and see how we can grow the whole certified pie much larger than the current figures that we've got. What is very important, and what has been said several times here, is that we need to adapt the processes to the national and to the local situations. We have, as Carlos said, the initiative that all forests are local. That's absolutely right. So when we're looking at finding ways of promoting sustainable forest management and biodiversity enhancement and maintenance, we need to work very much with local stakeholders at a national level in a bottom-up approach to try and get the appropriate actions and activities at a local level, but more importantly, to get local multi-stakeholder buy-in into those processes. And that is where we adopted a model whereby we develop systems at a local level, but we try to get them internationally recognized to an international benchmark. So I don't know whether you can see my mouse, maybe you can't, but it shows that PFC, when you look at PFC, when people talk about PFC, all of the national systems that we have, the 47 of them that are endorsed, are actually very much over and above the sustainability benchmark. You can't be below the benchmark. You have to meet the benchmark or exceed it. And that allows for local and national expectations to be built into standards, taking into consideration the unique situations such as demand for firewood and so on at a national level, and to see how one can then ensure that sustainability is achieved at a national and local level. Because we also do work in promoting market access and market recognition. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, because unless we change society's perceptions of what forests actually do, and that they are actually vital for the survival of mankind as a species, then we will need to make sure that people understand that working forests are good. They're good for people, but they're also good for biodiversity as well at the same time. We're constantly learning. This is one of the key things we all need to do. When we're revising the various processes, whether they be intergovernmental processes and so on, we're always needing to take in the latest knowledge. And here I'm just showing you some of the requirements. You can see that there are a lot more requirements for chain of custody at the moment in certification than there are for even just sustainable forest management. And that is because within chain of custody, which is basically where you take the wood from the forest through to the final products, you are constantly in a situation that you are seeing also materials which come from non-sustainably managed forests, which may be legal or non-controversial, finding their way into the value chain. And therefore, there have to be extra safeguards put in place there. That's why there's so many requirements for that. Even in the sustainable forest management requirements, which you can see here, 237, ultimately, when it comes to operational requirements, we're only talking about 54 of them, of which 34 of them specialize in biodiversity. So let's come to some of the impacts on the problems of how do we match commercial forestry and forestry which is for the people, by the people, and also biodiversity. We know, again, 80% of terrestrial biodiversity is located in forests, but there is also studies by Blue Green and so on which show that basically a healthy level of biodiversity also contributes to the productivity of working forests. And there's some studies which show that 10% loss in biodiversity leads to 3% loss in productivity. So maintaining biodiversity has great economic value and is something that foresters are very much aware of. So we need to make sure that we're constantly, among other things, balancing biodiversity with productivity. I want to have a little look now at some of the challenges that we have with respect to the Sustainable Development Goal. People are always thinking that 15 is the only one relevant to forestry. As I showed earlier on, there are many, many more. But here we have a range of indicators highlighting where we are in the progress towards sustainable forest management for each of the sub-indicators by the SDG regional groupings. There are two indicators that directly relate to the nexus of biodiversity and productivity, which is the proportions of forests under long-term management, which is now increased which increased to 2.1 billion hectares in 2010. And that's equally distributed between production and conservation purposes. And we see that there are positive changes in almost all regions. One of the indicators for certification, of course, there have been some increases in some areas. We're not making much of an impact, and there are lots of issues involved with that, not least the actual need also for resources. And that, as I said already, it needs an involvement of not just the voluntary sector, but actually the public sector as well as the business sector as well in achieving these targets. SFM as such, you will recognize this one as Carl mentioned earlier on, that of course in Georgia you've been developing your processes on the Forest Europe, and of course the certification movement a while back adopted the intergovernmental processes as the cornerstone for developing then operational criteria on the ground for ensuring performance-based forest certification measures. And I mean, the main one I've highlighted here is the number 4, the maintenance, conservation, and appropriate enhancement of biological diversity. But for biodiversity as such, of course, there are quite a few others which are just, or which have elements which are important as well. And so in a sort of calculation of the 54 operational requirements, at least 37 of them are specifically important to the maintenance and increase of biodiversity. One of the other things that we need to consider here is that we have recently introduced a process called trees outside forests, because although we may be looking at maintaining the biodiversity within forests, of course 20% of the world's industrial raw production actually comes from trees outside forests. So that's trees along the sides of fields and so on. And it's something that we need to be aware of, that through the inclusion of, let's say, for example, over 500 million landowners and small woodlot holders in Asia alone, the concept of trees outside forests allows those forests to enter into the value chain as well, and allows us to start working much more along a landscape approach to maintaining and making sure that we don't see the degradation of the forest resource outside the actual, or the degradation of the tree resource outside the forests themselves. And that is something that we really need to move forward. At the same time, trees outside forests are also very important because they are a key way of communicating with an increasingly urban population. So we're going to see urban forestry being certified more in the future and used as a mechanism to communicate with people, because the general public needs to have a better understanding, and it's our job as foresters, old and young, to make sure that we give the true pictures of where forests are. This slide here shows the need for balancing planet, people, and profit. In particular, you can see here where we look at the balancing of the ecosystems and biodiversity with areas such as productivity and economics. So one of the key things in here is that, again, in every single, sorry, let's go back up, every single forest area we need to identify, first of all, protect and conserve or set aside the ecologically important forest areas. It's absolutely important. And we need to do that in a landscape context. Again, health and vitality of forest ecosystems have to be maintained, but at the same time, we're also looking at maintaining the socioeconomic functions of forests, involving local people in forestry, and also making sure that communities, as well as indigenous peoples, are appropriately supported, and also that actually the knowledge which they share and the income generation that comes from that is shared with local people as well. If we now move on to the areas of chain of custody sectors, I mean, there's so many areas covered by forests, whether it's non-wood forest products. Fashion is one that surprises most people, but that's the one that gets the public attention. We were recently doing some work on one of our projects where we looked at the talking trees, and effectively what we're doing there is we're trying to persist in a project which looks at the daily fluctuations of carbon dioxide absorption and emissions from forests. But by doing that, we've linked sensors to some trees in Italy, which directly go to the laboratory where the results can be recorded. And as a communications tool, we had over 57 million hits just on the talking trees alone. The other one is, of course, fashion, that really grabs urban population's attention, and particularly a younger person's attention, much more than we would have thought in the traditional communications on forestry. Of course, We're seeing certification being accepted more and more also by governments, public procurement policies. The latest assessment just now is being done by the Dutch public procurement policies on the new standards, which we introduced in 2018, to ensure that we can also meet all of the requirements of government, but we actually also need government to become much more involved in forest certification. So I'm looking forward to the day that also Georgia has its own national forest certification system with the involvement of local people through their local forests as well. Consumers, very important again. We need to be aware of the fact that they actually do believe a lot in labeling and so on. Maybe they're beginning to believe more in governments now with the current COVID-19 crisis, because people are basically saying, don't rely on social media, start looking again at what actually governments are saying, and the World Health Organization when it comes to certain situations. So maybe if we were to do this survey again in a year's time, we might have a slightly different perception. But overall, the trends have been that people rely on certification for ethical considerations, and that's something that we need to just work on and use more in our communications with the general public. Labels, you'll see them on lots of things. I'm sure you've seen them also from our colleagues FSC. And then there are a couple of other things that we need to look at when we're looking particularly in the issue of construction. We need to be aware of that if we were using construction instead of concrete, we would be reducing the global carbon dioxide emissions by about 31%. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm pleading here for using wood only and not using concrete. We need to get the balance right. But 50% of us live in cities, and as that grows, we're going to need homes for 3 billion people over the next 20 years. We've got an estimated 1 billion people in the world who are living in slums, and there are actually 100 million people who went to bed without a roof over their heads last night. So we are aware of the fact that if we're going to start providing solutions to raise people's livelihood standards of living and so on, we're going to have to use a lot more wood. And that means we're going to have to manage those woods and ensure that the balance between biodiversity and production are maintained. Just to give you an example, the pressures on forests are different in different parts of the world. On average in Europe, you have, if you include Russia as well, you've got roughly 2 hectares per person. But when you start going to Asia, you're going down to 0.45 hectares per person, even less than that in certain countries. So we're aware of the fact we need to know that the pressures are increasing, and we need to use forestry as an important tool. And in order to get that confidence, people need to know that it's certified and that biodiversity is part of the process. Packaging, again, people moving away from plastics, using much more paper. And we've seen suddenly, for example, Tesco's, a large retailer in the United Kingdom, actually just sold some of their stores in Asia, but they were basically saying that effectively they want to, from 2025 onwards, only use paper and paper-based products for all of their packaging and move away from plastic. So they are desperate to get a hold of any fiber-based material. COVID has suddenly shown us also how important toilet paper is to many people, even if they are only stockpiling it. But in a way, we see that people are looking for more and more products from forests, so it needs to be responsibly sourced, and we need to do that through certification. Fashion, again, a really interesting area from communications alone. But if you compare, for example, wood-based products and wood-based fibers from forests which are no longer allowed to be, which have been used maybe also for paper production, one of the better returns in a forest is if you actually use the fiber for viscose and other clothes-based products. And so we're seeing that effectively that fiber from wood uses only 1/3 of the energy and 1/60th of the water, and hardly any chemicals at all. If you compare it to cotton, cotton covers 1% of the world's land mass, but uses 24% of the world's pesticides. So there's an awful lot of reasons why we should be using a lot more wood. This is what retailers like. Wood-based fibers emit about 15 times less carbon than synthetic fibers. And so, we're going to see a lot more demand for wood. I'm sorry, I've gone over by 2 minutes. I apologize, Frederick. I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much for your input. No worries about stepping over the timeline here. Yeah, so now we had like all the three speakers. We will now just give you briefly a summary, and then we will open for a question and answer session. First of all, I want to ask Ben if you are able to stay maybe 15 minutes longer with us.
Of course.
Do you have? Yeah, thank you very much. All right, great. So we began with like an input from the CBD, from Christian and Yara, and what became obvious is that forests have diverse services. There is a need to reconnect with local people, and through the great work of the GYBN, intergenerational justice found its way into the CBD, now more strongly than ever before. We then moved on to Georgia, where there was a special focus also again on the ecosystem services that need to be considered in forest management. There is a concept that all forests should be local, so that there is a decentralized co-management approach developing. And building on this, we now had the input from Mr. Ben Gunneberg from PFC International on the decentralized and locally adapted certification of PFC, and also a very interesting point to use urban forest certification for advocacy and educational work for sustainable forest management and a sustainable future, while also highlighting in the end that there is a need to develop and search for new markets if we want to use the sustainable produced wood. With this, I would give the floor to Alina and Barbara, who will facilitate now the question and answer section. There were many questions asked. We might not be able to answer all of them, but let's see how far we come.
Thank you, Frederick. Thank you all for your questions. We tried to go through all of them and select some for our speakers. We would like you to answer as short and precisely as you can, seeing as we're short on time. And the first question we have goes to Christian. While habitat fragmentation is such a huge problem, combined with climate change affecting the life cycle of many species, both plants and animals, is an assessment of biodiversity just by number of species enough? How do we incorporate better ecosystem health as a target to be achieved?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think this is absolutely true, and there is increasing recognition that we cannot only look at the health of individual species, but that we have to look at the health of entire ecosystems. There is the IPBS, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the CBD is moving increasingly to a process to follow those recommendations and to look at ecosystems as a whole. And I think there is recognition of that in the Zero Draft, but also on the targets, but there is much more that needs to be done, but we're moving in that direction. I think it's very good that you're also highlighting the importance of that.
Thank you, everyone, on my behalf too. Thank you all the speakers and question askers. I have a question for Yara. You mentioned that the society, especially in cities, often have no clear understanding of biodiversity and its importance to us. What do you think is the role of youth and students organizations such as GYBN and IFSA in this regard?
Yeah, I think by doing, even if we consider them small-scale activities, we can spread the word and have this bridge between people living in cities and forests, rural communities, and the benefits of forests. For instance, in Beirut, they organize a farmer's market every Saturday, so people from the city go to this farmer's market and meet rural communities who bring all of their products from mountain areas, and these are mostly food and art supplies that are handmade. Another thing is going to schools, major schools in big cities, and doing awareness campaigns and talking to these students about
about other people who are living far, let's say, in mountains, and also organizing field trips to these areas. Ecotouristic field trips for students is the way, because these students will then push their parents to also organize such activities in their families every weekend. And we've seen this in schools in Beirut. So I think these two ideas pop in my mind.
Thank you, Yara. Our next question is for Carlo. How does Georgia define sustainable forest management? Is the definition available for download on a website?
Thank you. The process was it was a long process of developing of the criteria and indicators. We are still working on this issue together with the UNEC FAO forestry section, but also with the Forest Europe and other international experts and communities. So it is in English also for download, but if the author of this question provide me the email address, I can share personally all the information about the sustainable forest management criteria, and also the process in which we are now. So because the special fact sheets are now under the development for each indicator.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlo. And then we have a question for Ben. What is the potential of municipal landscape planners and architects in forest certification or certification of trees outside of forests?
Look, we for planners and so on, I mean, for architects, first of all, we're doing quite a lot of work. We've now, for 3 years, been part of the World Architectural Festival, and we provide a special prize for buildings built from certified timber, regardless of which system. And what we actually do there, when we used to have, when in the first year we had about 12 entries, and we're now over 50 entries, and it's becoming a bigger, more important prize overall. Because actually architects love working with wood. If you want to see a fantastic talk, just have a look at Michael Green on TED Talks, and just type in Vancouver trees architecture. You'll see a fantastic talk about how architects love wood. But also for planners to use a lot more wood, we need to actually spend much more time persuading regulations, building regulations to change. And we've been doing that in places like Singapore and the United States. Sometimes we get opposition, for example, with concrete. People have been saying, you know, big wooden buildings burn, therefore don't allow them to be built. We have to overcome the lack of knowledge or the ignorance about that, particularly when people are promoting their own commercial interests over actually society's interests of a more sustainable building material and a sustainable development of cities within the landscape. Trees outside forests are very important for that. Again, 20% of the world's industrial roundwood comes from trees outside forests.
Thank you. The next question is for Christian. As one of the challenges for implementation, you mentioned, among others, political priorities. The current development around the coronavirus shows what is possible if governments really want to implement something. What would need to change in how we communicate the urgency of the biodiversity topic to get a similar response?
Oh, I love that question. This is really something that is going on in my mind a lot, because when I was showing you this carousel, I'm really tired of, like, you know, like in the CBD, we're agreeing on targets. Then after a couple of years, we realized that we're failing to meet them. We realize what are the reasons for failing to reach them. And then what are we doing? We're just agreeing on new targets, as if like just agreeing on targets, just creating like, you know, new measures on paper would change it. Like, I think what you can see here is, if an issue is really urgent, it is possible to mobilize political will. And I'm not sure if the coronavirus crisis is a fair comparison, but it shows us a lot of what is possible, a lot of like how people can act when you know, lives are on stake, when entire economies are on stake. And that's the problem with biodiversity. Biodiversity is the basis of all our survival. And if we don't like take ambitious action now, if we don't take these targets serious, and if we don't really listen to the people that work on the ground, then we're going to get into a much worse situation than we're now with the virus. The thing is, biodiversity loss is nothing that you see from one day to another. Like with the virus, you see the numbers springing up every day, and it's in your face that you see that something absolutely urgently needs to be done. Biodiversity loss is something that is more slower. So this is the problem is that we have to communicate biodiversity loss in a way that more people can understand it. And it is also a challenge of like explaining to them the whole concept of biodiversity loss. So I think the first challenge here is in terms of communication, not just to the wider population, but also communication to political leaders, making them aware why, as a finance minister, for instance, it's equally important to act on biodiversity like it is for an environmental minister. So just political awareness is one that we have to create. The other one is that we really have to connect top-down and bottom-up processes more effectively with each other. If we're going to a CBD meeting and you only see bureaucrats coming from ministries that are rarely spending much time working with people like you guys, like foresters, for instance, then we have a problem. So we really need to bring like these levels together. And I think only if we do this, we can create this sense of urgency, this sense of this sense of a can-do attitude that the biodiversity crisis is solvable if we mobilize political will. I could talk about this for ages, so like just a couple of points. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you, Christian. The next question is for Carlo, and maybe Ben could quickly comment on it as well. So even if a product is legal, it might not have been sustainably produced. How many times this is confusing for both the consumers and producers? How to address that? How to focus more on integrating ecological, social and economic sustainability in sustainable forest management?
So maybe I will start. I don't understand because of the bad connection, the first part, but how to combine. It is a really difficult question, but at the same time very interesting. So in the sustainable forest management, we need the people in the involvement in the forestry activities. This means that the people need the forest, they are demanding on the resources, and they also understand that if they are using unsustainably, they will have not the access more to the resources. So we, hand in hand, we should ensure that they see also other services from the forest, not only wood from the forest, and not only the responsibility how to get the resources from the forest out. So this means that we are creating, including in the sustainable forest management, green jobs. We are creating the green jobs, the people who are working in the forestry or for the forestry activities. And another part is the ecotourism. So the bungalows, the roads inside of the forest, or the touristical roads in the forest, and the people, especially the locals, who are benefiting from this, from the products. On one hand, on another hand, they have they are directly using the forestry and forest resources in different type of directions. It is tourism, wood, non-timber forest products, and very important is a precautionary principle, and the safety issues. So on one hand for the workers, but on the other hand, in a mountains area, it is crucial that the people understand that non-sustainable management means landslides and other diseases which impacts their life and impacts the livelihood. So there are different options how we can combine these two directions with each other, and it's, I think, a special topic for a special webinar, I think.
Yeah, if I can just add on the question of legal wood not necessarily being sustainably sourced, it's absolutely right. You have situations where legality doesn't mean respecting indigenous people's rights. Legality can also mean using child labor or bonded labor, depending which country you're in. So the only way to actually be absolutely certain that you're not contributing to anything of that is to take certified timber and labeled timber, and that whether it's FSC, PEFC, or any of its member schemes, and many of them, such as SFI, have their own label and so on. You need to look for a certification label, because all of those systems have got in place the proportion up to 30% of legal timber, but it has to be non-controversial, which means specific issues such as conversions or child labor or prison labor or slave labor, and all these areas are excluded from those value chains. So for all of you, only buy timber or any wood-based product with a label on it.
Thank you very much. And now we have one more question for everyone. Name one thing that is most important to you to enhance forest biodiversity. Maybe we can go in the same order, Christian, and so on.
Sorry, my connection was a bit interrupted. Can you repeat this?
Of course. We're asking for statements. Name one thing that is most important to you to enhance forest biodiversity. First Christian, then Yara, then Carlo, and then Ben.
Okay, for me, the most important thing would be reconnecting people with forests, especially people in urban areas are sometimes forgetting how important forest areas are. So I think educating and reconnecting them would be most important.
Thank you. Yara is next.
Yeah, well, for me, I think policies, at the end of the day, everything we work for is to influence and to change policies. And without a good governance framework, I don't think we can get anywhere. So I think our role as individuals is to reach out and get our voices heard for policymakers to change things.
Thank you very much. Carlo, what do you think?
I think we should show the politics and the society to all members of and the people who are part of the society, why it is important to protect the biodiversity. Only then we can achieve the goals for the better protection of biodiversity. Otherwise, if the people don't understand and they think that this is only the nice trees or animals or ecosystems, they cannot be able to protect the biodiversity. And in general, I think this is the very important issue for, and number one is the mainstreaming of biodiversity in all the sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ben.
Yeah, for me, I think one of the key things is the role of youth here. Christian mentioned earlier on, you know, about the COVID virus and how that grabs political attention, and the problem with CBD that when there's a non-conformance, we just make new targets and so on. Actually, it's time we held the policymakers accountable, and that's where youth with its social media has a really huge role to play. The kind of international embarrassment and so on mechanisms, they don't actually work that well, as we've seen in some countries. And if you do it at an international level, you end up basically getting into a nationalistic mentality where people are basically defending themselves against the rest of the world, because they're being accused of spreading fake news. So we actually need people within the countries which are not complying and which are not making the difference to make a lot of noise with the politicians and really raise those issues up high. Participate in the protest, tweet about it, do all the various TikTok, whatever else it is, get up there and make sure that basically the policymakers are involved, and educate yourself and make sure people are involved in an informed discussion and learn about these processes.
Great. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for the speakers, for Yara, for Christian, for Carl, and for Ben, for joining us today at this time on Saturday. It was a very, very interesting session. I'm very grateful that you also stayed a bit longer to answer some questions. I want to also thank still 65 people who are in the call. We had like around 78 people at its top. So that's extremely good also for us to know that it worked out. IFSA and also UNFF MGCY will continue to work also in these difficult times on programs, on projects, to keep each other updated, educated, in times where we are not able to maybe move freely around. I want to invite everyone to stay in contact with us, to collaborate with us. Just write us a mail, say what you want to do, say how you can support us. And we're really looking forward to work with you. And with this, I would maybe say goodbye. The speakers maybe also want to say goodbye. I want to wish everyone lots of health these days. Stay safe and sound. Protect your families, your friends, and keep on protecting the environment and the forests. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your time. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Ciao.